My name is Claire Novick. I'm 38 years old, and I learned what my sister really thought of me the morning a process server knocked on my front door at 7:14 a.m. on a Tuesday. I was holding a mug of coffee in one hand and a permission slip for my son's field trip in the other. The man on my porch had a clipboard and an apologetic expression, and he asked me to confirm my name before he handed me the envelope. Inside was a summons. My sister, Renee, was suing me for wrongful eviction, emotional distress, and $85,000 in damages. The house she was suing me over was a property I had spent 4 years, and every spare dollar I had renovating from a condemned shell into a home. The house she was suing me over was a place she had never paid a single month of rent to occupy. The house she was suing me over had my name on the deed, my signature on the permits, my sweat in the walls, and somehow, according to the paperwork in my hand, it was the source of her suffering. I stood on my porch in my bathrobe and read the summons twice. Then I went inside, sat down at the kitchen table, and opened my laptop. Because that's what I do when the world comes apart. I find the folder and I start building the case. What I found over the next 3 weeks, document by document, was not just the story of a property dispute. It was the story of 9 years of a family that had quietly decided I was the kind of person whose generosity had no bottom, and who had never once been curious about whether that assumption might someday be wrong. Welcome to silent drama stories, where the people who were never supposed to speak up finally do. If you've ever been the one in your family who holds everything together while everyone else holds out their hand, this story is for you. Drop a comment and tell me, have you ever been sued by someone you were helping? Because what happened next, I could not have written if I tried. Let me tell you who I was before that Tuesday morning, because it matters. I grew up in Dayton, Ohio, the oldest of 2 daughters born to Ray and Carol Novick. My father drove a school bus for 22 years. My mother worked the front desk at a dental office. We were not poor, but we were close enough to it that you always knew which month was hard and which one wasn't, and you learned early to tell the difference. We rented our whole lives. 3 different houses in 3 different neighborhoods by the time I left for college, always chasing a landlord who would agree to hold the deposit. I think that's where it started, honestly. That particular hunger. The understanding that the families who owned things were different from the families who didn't, and that the distance between those 2 kinds of families was not luck. It was paper. Deeds and titles and amortization schedules. Numbers on documents that the owning families understood and the renting families mostly didn't. I understood them. I had that kind of brain, the kind that finds comfort in columns and categories. I went to Ohio State on a partial scholarship and worked 20 hours a week at a title company to cover the rest, which turned out to be the most useful education I got during those 4 years. By the time I graduated with a degree in finance, I already knew more about property transfer law than most people learn in a lifetime of homeownership. I married Marcus when I was 27. Marcus is a high school history teacher, which means he is brilliant and patient and makes exactly the salary you would expect, which is to say we have always lived on mine. That was a choice we made together, eyes open, because Marcus's work matters, and because my income was sufficient to carry us if we were careful. We have a son, Owen, who is 11 now and who has his father's patience, and my insistence on understanding how things actually work before forming an opinion about them. We bought our first home at 29, a small house in a neighborhood that was just beginning to recover from a decade of neglect. I had read enough about property cycles to know what I was looking at, and we got in early, which meant we got in cheap. We lived there for 4 years, and when the neighborhood had recovered enough that we could sell for a meaningful profit, we did. We rolled that profit into a larger house for our family and a down payment on a small rental property. That's how it started. 1 property, then 2. By the time I was 35, I owned 3 rental units outright, managed them myself, handled my own lease agreements, my own maintenance coordination, my own books. It was not a glamorous business. It was nights and weekends and tenant calls at midnight about water heaters and the constant, unglamorous work of maintaining things that wanted to fall apart. But it was mine. Every square foot of it was mine in a way that nothing in my childhood ever had been. And I understood the weight of that in a way I cannot fully explain to someone who grew up with a deed in the family. My sister Renee is 4 years younger than me and has always occupied a different relationship with the concept of ownership. Renee is the kind of person who is wonderful in a crisis that belongs to someone else and completely undone by a crisis that belongs to her. She is funny and warm and the most charismatic person in any room she walks into, and she has spent most of her adult life relying on that charisma, the way other people rely on a savings account. It works until it doesn't. By the time she was 30, Renee had been through 2 significant relationships, 3 apartments, a brief and unsuccessful attempt at starting a catering business, and 1 stint living with our parents that lasted 14 months longer than anyone had planned. She had a good heart, genuinely. She was not calculating in the way that some people mistake for ambition. She just had an absolute, foundational belief that things would work out, that someone would catch her, that the net was always there below the trapeze. For most of her life, I was a significant part of that net. And I did it willingly. I want to be clear about that. I was not a passive victim of my sister's needs. I am the older one. I am the capable one. I had made myself available for that role the way I had made myself available for every role that needed someone steady at the center of it. And for a long time, I told myself that was love, and I think for a long time it was. The line between love and enabling is thinner than anyone tells you, and it doesn't announce itself when you cross it. You just look up one day and realize you've been standing on the other side of it for years. The property at 114 Clement Street was the 3rd rental I purchased. I bought it in the spring of my 34th year at an estate auction for $47,000, which was less than the land alone was worth in that zip code, because the house itself had been condemned. The previous owner had let it deteriorate for the better part of a decade after his wife passed, and the city had finally stepped in. There was mold in 2 of the 3 bedrooms. The roof had a section that had simply given up. Every window on the north side of the house was either broken or painted shut, which had contributed to the mold situation in a way I spent 3 months unraveling. I put $61,000 into that house over the following 4 years. Not all at once, but methodically in the order the structure demanded. Roof first, then foundation repair, then electrical, then the mold remediation, which took 2 months and cost more than the first 3 items combined. Then plumbing, then windows, then drywall, then finishes. I hired contractors for the structural work and did the painting and the trim work myself, nights and weekends, with Marcus handing me tools and Owen asleep in his car seat in the driveway during the early years when he was too small to leave with a sitter, and we couldn't afford one anyway. By the time I finished, 114 Clement was a 3-bedroom house with original hardwood floors I had refinished myself, a completely updated kitchen, a bathroom that had been taken to the studs and rebuilt, and a small backyard with a fence I had staked and strung on a Saturday in October with my father, who had driven 3 hours to help me, and who spent the whole drive home telling my mother on the phone that his daughter had built something real. The house appraised at $187,000. I had invested $108,000, counting the purchase price. I had a $34,000 first mortgage on it. My equity position was significant. My plan was to rent it at market rate, which in that neighborhood at that time was approximately $1,450 a month, generate consistent cash flow, and refinance in 2 years to pull equity for the next acquisition. That was the plan. Renee called me in March of the year I finished the renovations. She was crying before I answered, which was not unusual, but the particular register of the crying told me this was not a small crisis. She had been living with a man named Derek for 2 years, a relationship I had watched with the specific wariness of an older sister who has seen her sibling choose comfort over compatibility too many times to count. Derek had asked her to leave. He was keeping the apartment. She had 30 days to find somewhere to go, and she had $300 in her checking account and a storage unit full of furniture and nowhere to put any of it. I listened. I asked questions. I did not say what I was thinking, which was that I had watched this exact moment coming for approximately 18 months and had mentioned it gently twice and been told I was being negative. I asked her what she needed. She said she needed a place to stay for a few months while she got back on her feet. She had a job interview the following week at a marketing firm, and she was almost certain she was going to get it. And if she did, she'd be able to start paying rent by the second month, and she just needed a bridge, just a little bridge. I had a house sitting empty. I had just finished it. I was 2 weeks from listing it. I said yes. I want to sit with that moment for a second, because it's the hinge everything else swings on. I said yes. I said it knowing that the house was ready to generate income. I said it knowing that my sister had a history with bridges that were only supposed to be temporary. I said it anyway, because she was my sister and she was crying and the house was empty, and I had spent my whole life being the one who said yes when no one else would. What I should have done, and what I know now with the absolute clarity that only consequence provides, was hand her a lease. A real one, written and signed and filed. Market rate or discounted, that was a conversation we could have had. But a document, a defined term, an explicit agreement about what this was and what it wasn't. I did not do that. I told her she could stay for 3 months, we'd reassess, and she should let me know when the job came through so we could talk about numbers. I said it out loud, but I did not write it down, and I did not ask her to sign it, and those 2 failures are what she built her lawsuit on 4 years later. Renee moved into 114 Clement Street on a Thursday in April. I helped her move. Marcus borrowed a truck from a colleague, and we spent 6 hours hauling her storage unit into the house I had spent 4 years building. And when we were done, Renee stood in the kitchen with a glass of wine and said it was the most beautiful place she had ever lived, and I felt proud and glad and completely certain that I had done the right thing. The job interview went well. She got a second interview, and then a third, and then in July, 2 months after she moved in, she got the job. I took her to dinner to celebrate. We talked about lease terms over appetizers. She said she wanted to pay something, she absolutely wanted to contribute, and she proposed $600 a month to start, with a plan to get to market rate within 6 months as she got established in the new role. I should have written that down at the dinner table on a napkin and made us both sign it. I nodded and said that sounded reasonable, and we ordered dessert. $600 arrived in my account in August. It was the last payment I ever received. In September, Renee called to say the first month at the new job had been harder than expected. There were upfront costs she hadn't anticipated, professional clothing and a parking pass, and a software subscription her role required. And could she defer October's payment and double up in November? I said, of course. November came and she said December would be better. Things were picking up. She'd gotten a small bonus, and she was going to use it to catch up. December came and there was a family situation. Our mother had a health scare that turned out to be nothing serious but had been terrifying for 2 weeks, and the holidays were expensive, and she'd make it right in January. I want to describe what this pattern felt like from the inside, because I think if you have been the reliable one in a family, you already know. Each individual ask was reasonable. Each individual circumstance was real. Our mother did have a health scare. The job really was hard at the start. The holidays really are expensive. Every single domino examined alone was a domino that fell on any normal person. The problem was not any one domino. The problem was that my sister had arranged her entire life into a structure where the dominoes never stopped falling, and I was the floor they fell onto. By the end of the first year, Renee had paid me $600 total against what would have been $17,400 at market rate, or $7,200 at the discounted rate she had proposed herself. I had not said anything direct yet. I want to be honest about my own role in this. I had hinted. I had mentioned that the property was costing me in lost income. I had said a couple of times that we really did need to formalize things. But I had not sat down and said clearly, Renee, you agreed to pay rent. You have paid almost none. This has to change by a specific date or I need the property back. I had not said that because saying it felt like failing her, and I had spent my whole life arranging myself around the idea that I was the one who did not fail people. In the second year, Renee's job ended. The marketing firm was acquired and her position was eliminated. She called me crying again, the same register as the first call, and I felt the same pull, the same immediate softening, the same voice inside me that said she needs you. You can handle this, be the steady one. I told her not to worry about rent while she was job searching. I told her to focus on landing something good. I told her the house was hers as long as she needed it. Those words, the house was hers as long as she needed it. I said them out loud, on the phone, without a single thought about what they would look like in a legal filing 2 years later. The job search lasted 8 months. During those 8 months, I received no rent. I also received, in no particular order, 17 requests for advice on her resume, 3 requests for money to cover her phone bill, 1 request to co-sign a car loan, which I declined, a lengthy conversation in which she explained that she was thinking of pivoting to event planning and would need startup capital, and a complete silence from her on the subject of 114 Clement Street, as if its existence as my financial asset was a topic we had both agreed not to discuss. She found a new job in the spring of year 2, this time in event coordination, which was closer to what she actually wanted. The pay was less than the marketing role. I was genuinely happy for her. We had dinner to celebrate again. The rent conversation came up again, briefly. She said she was going to get back on track. I said I really did need her to. Neither of us defined what that meant. In the 3rd year, I received 4 payments. They arrived sporadically, $400 here, $300 there, with texts that said catching up soon, I promise, or this is just a partial but more coming. The more never came. The total for year 3 was $1,400. By the beginning of year 4, I had received $2,000 total from my sister against a property that had been sitting idle as a rental for 3 years. If I had listed it at market rate the day she moved in, I would have collected $52,200. Even at the discounted rate she had proposed, I would have collected $25,200. The gap between what I had received and what I had either lost or foregone was one of the first things I calculated when I finally made myself sit down and look at the numbers, and the number that came out the other side was not one I was ready for. What broke something open in me was not any single event. It wasn't a dramatic confrontation or a cruel comment or a moment of obvious betrayal. It was a photograph. Renee posted it on a Saturday afternoon in October of year 4. She was at a resort 2 hours south of the city, weekend trip with friends. There she was in a pool with a drink, laughing, genuinely happy, genuinely beautiful, absolutely thriving. And underneath the photo she had written the caption, "Life is short, invest in joy." I sat with my phone in my hand in the kitchen of the house I owned, where my son was doing homework at the table and my husband was cooking dinner, and I felt something shift in me that did not shift back. Life is short, invest in joy. I had been investing in her joy for 4 years. I had foregone tens of thousands of dollars in rental income. I had let a productive asset sit beneath its potential for 4 years because I could not bring myself to ask my sister to leave or pay. And she was at a resort. She was fine. She had money for resort weekends and drinks by the pool. She simply did not have money for the rent she had offered to pay to the sister who had handed her a house. And she had organized her life around the assumption that this would continue indefinitely, because it always had. I did not call her that night. I opened a spreadsheet instead. I exported every bank statement from the past 4 years, all the accounts, and I built a complete ledger of the property at 114 Clement Street. Purchase price, renovation costs, mortgage payments, property taxes, insurance, maintenance calls I had made on her behalf during her tenancy, everything. Then I built a second column showing what the property should have earned at market rate across the same period, conservatively, without assuming any increases. The gap between column 1 and column 2 was $54,400, not counting the initial investment. Then I opened a third tab and I started writing down every conversation I could recall in which rent had been discussed, every text I could find, every voicemail I had saved. I had saved more than I realized. I tend to save things. It's a finance brain habit, the archival instinct, the understanding that documentation is the only thing that holds when memory fails or convenience reshapes the past. What I had was not nothing. It wasn't a signed lease, but it was a pattern of texts in which Renee referred to rent repeatedly in her own words, promising to pay, acknowledging the debt, explaining delays. She had never disputed that she owed it. She had only never paid it. I sat at that kitchen table until 11 o'clock at night. When Marcus came to find me, he looked at the screen and he looked at my face and he pulled up a chair and said quietly, "How bad is it?" I turned the laptop toward him. He read both columns without speaking. Then he said, "What do you want to do?" I said I didn't know yet, but I knew I was done not knowing. The first thing I did was talk to a lawyer. I found a real estate attorney in my city named Patricia Chen, who came recommended by one of the other landlords in my local property owners group. I laid out the entire situation, chronologically, with my spreadsheet and my text records and every document I had, and I let her read it before I said another word. She read quietly, and when she was done, she set the papers down and looked at me with the specific expression of someone who has heard this story before. She told me several things that I needed to hear. The first was that without a signed lease, my sister technically occupied the property in a status called a tenancy at will, which meant she had rights that a pure trespasser would not have. The second was that the texts acknowledging rent were useful but not equivalent to a contract. The third was that evicting a family member, even one with no lease, required following proper legal procedure, and that doing it incorrectly would cost me more than doing it correctly. She also told me the texts establishing an oral rent agreement were meaningful, and that if I wanted to pursue the back rent through small claims or civil court, I had a reasonable case, though not a guaranteed one. I told her my priority was the property. I wanted Renee out. Cleanly, legally, with documentation so airtight that nothing she said afterward could stick. The back rent was a secondary question. Patricia drafted a formal notice to vacate. 30 days, as required by the state for a tenancy of this duration. It stated that the property was required for purposes of the owner and that occupancy must conclude by a specific date. It was delivered by certified mail and by a process server on the same day, so that there could be no question of whether it had been received. I called Renee the morning the notice was served, before she could see it and call me in the register I already knew. I wanted her to hear my voice first. She answered on the second ring, cheerful, assuming a normal call. I told her I needed to talk to her about the house. I told her I had sent her a legal notice and that it would arrive today or tomorrow, and that I wanted her to hear from me directly rather than just receive a document. I told her I had been patient and that the situation had gone on too long and that I needed the property back by the date specified in the notice, which was 30 days from that morning. The silence on the line lasted long enough that I thought she might have hung up. She hadn't. When she spoke, her voice had changed entirely. Not crying, not the call for help register, something I had heard much less often from Renee, and that was cold. "You can't do this," she said. "This is my home. I've lived here for 4 years." I told her I understood she felt that way, and that I was sorry, and that the notice was legally valid. "You said I could stay as long as I needed," she said. I said I remembered the conversation and that circumstances had changed. She said that wasn't how it worked, that I had made a promise, that she had built her life around this house. I told her I hoped she would use the 30 days to find something suitable, and that I was willing to help her search if she wanted. She hung up. She did not use the 30 days to search for somewhere to go. What she did instead, as I would learn, was find a tenants' rights attorney who told her she had a viable case for wrongful eviction based on the verbal promise I had made in year 2, the one where I told her the house was hers as long as she needed it. She also claimed that my failure to provide a written lease had created an implicit tenancy agreement with no defined end date, and that my sudden notice to vacate constituted a breach of that implied agreement. She was suing me for $85,000, which her attorney had calculated as 2 years of what she characterized as the fair market value of alternate housing she would now be forced to seek, plus emotional distress damages, plus what she claimed were improvements she had made to the property during her tenancy. The improvements she listed were a coat of paint in the second bedroom, which I had not authorized, and which I would later need to repaint over because she had chosen a color called Midnight Harvest that was approximately the shade of a bruise. New curtains in the living room, a garden bed in the backyard which she had dug into the lawn without my permission, and which had caused some drainage issues that I was going to need to address. A shelf unit she had assembled and mounted to the wall of the kitchen, which was technically a fixture. She was claiming $85,000 in damages, in part, for curtains and a shelf. I went back to Patricia's office the morning after I received the summons, with the process server's envelope and the spreadsheet and every text message, printed in full, organized chronologically, with the timestamps preserved. I also brought on a separate sheet of paper the specific texts in which Renee had referred to her obligation to pay rent, acknowledged the amount, and promised future payment. 12 of them over 4 years. 12 separate acknowledgments, in her own words from her own phone, saved in my phone, printed and dated. Patricia read through the filing. Then she read through my counter-documentation. She looked up and said, carefully, that this was going to be a situation where the strength of the written record would matter enormously, and that I appeared to have a considerably better record than my sister might have anticipated. She also said something that I have thought about many times since. She said that the texts acknowledging the rent obligation were potentially useful not just defensively, but offensively, in the form of a counterclaim, and that I should think carefully about whether I wanted to pursue the back rent as part of this proceeding. I told her I needed to sit with that. I drove home through the city on a route that took me past 114 Clement Street. I had a key, still. I always had a key because it was my house and I had never surrendered that right, even when I had surrendered nearly everything else. I parked in front for a moment and looked at it. The house looked good from the outside. The paint was holding. The gutters I had replaced 2 years prior were clear. The front porch railing I had built from scratch was still solid. Inside, I knew, there was a bedroom painted the color of a bruise and curtains I had not chosen and a shelf on my kitchen wall and a garden bed destroying my lawn drainage. There was also 4 years of living. There was a life my sister had built in the house I had built, and it was all tangled together in a way that the law was going to have to sort out, because we had not sorted it ourselves while there was still time. I thought about my father, and the way he had driven 3 hours to help me build that fence, and the way he had called my mother from the highway to tell her that his daughter had built something real. I thought about Owen, who had sat in his car seat in the driveway while I painted, and who was now 11 and who had asked me once, carefully, whether Aunt Renee was going to live in the house forever, and whether that bothered me. I had told him no, which was true on the first part and a lie on the second. I called Patricia from the car. I told her to file the counterclaim. The discovery process in a civil case is something I was not emotionally prepared for, even though I had spent weeks preparing practically. Renee's attorney submitted a request for all communications between us regarding the property. I submitted mine. What came back from her side was a carefully curated selection of texts, the ones where I had said generous things, the ones where I had told her not to worry about rent, the ones where I had told her the house was hers as long as she needed it. They were real texts. I had sent them. I was not going to pretend I hadn't. What my 12 texts showed, when laid alongside hers, was a more complete picture. A picture in which my sister had, over 4 years, in her own words, referred to the rent as something she owed, something she was going to pay, something she kept deferring. "I know I'm behind," she wrote in February of year 3. "I'm going to make this right," she wrote in June of that same year. "Once this project wraps, I'll have a lump sum for you," she wrote in November. None of those lump sums had arrived. Her attorney characterized these texts as evidence of a good faith intention that had been frustrated by circumstances. My attorney characterized them as evidence that Renee herself understood and acknowledged a rental obligation that she had systematically failed to meet. In the middle of the discovery period, I got a call from my mother. My mother, Carol, is a woman who was raised to believe that the worst thing a family can do is air itself out in public, and that any conflict, no matter how serious, is better resolved quietly at a kitchen table than loudly in any formal setting. She is not a bad woman. She is a woman who has organized her entire emotional life around the prevention of scenes, and who had spent my whole childhood teaching me to be the one who prevented them, which is a large part of how I had ended up in a situation where my sister was suing me for living in a house I owned for free. Carol called at 8 in the evening, which meant she had thought about calling all day and had finally decided she had to. She did not ask me how I was. She said, "Claire, this has to stop. You two have to work this out. This is a family matter." I told her we had tried to work it out and that Renee had filed a lawsuit, which was not working it out. Carol said that Renee was under a lot of stress and that she hadn't really understood the legal situation and that her attorney had told her she had a case and she had believed him. I asked my mother if she knew that Renee had lived in my house for 4 years and paid me $2,000 total. A long silence. She said she knew things had been difficult. I asked her if she knew that 114 Clement had cost me $108,000 to acquire and renovate, and that it had been sitting below its income potential for 4 years, because I had let Renee live there without a lease. Another silence. She said she hadn't known all the details. I told her I loved her and I loved Renee, and that the lawsuit was going to go where it was going to go, and that I hoped my mother understood I had not chosen this. Renee had chosen this. My mother said she just hoped we could find a way to keep the family together. I said I hoped so too, but I also said something I had not planned to say, something that came out of the 4 years and the spreadsheet and the resort photograph and the process server on my porch at 7:14 in the morning. I said, "Mom, I have been keeping this family together since I was Renee's age. I have been the one who catches her, every time. And I need you to understand that I cannot keep doing that if the result is a lawsuit." My mother cried a little. We hung up having resolved nothing and having said, I think, more than we had said to each other in a decade. I did not hear from my father during this period. My father had a way of stepping back from conflict that I had always characterized as quiet dignity and that I was beginning to reframe as something less flattering. He loved us both. He would not take a side. He would not make a call. He would wait for it to resolve and then be present for whoever was left. That was the way my father moved through difficulty. I had spent years admiring it. I was not admiring it just then. 3 days before the scheduled mediation, Renee called me. I answered because I had decided that no matter what, I was not going to be the one who stopped picking up. She had placed herself in the position of suing me. I was not going to compound the situation by becoming someone who couldn't be reached. Her voice was different from either of the registers I knew. Not the crying call voice, and not the cold after the notice voice. Something quieter and more uncertain, like a person who has spent several weeks looking at herself from a new angle and has not entirely liked what she saw. She said she wanted to talk without the lawyers. I said that was fine as long as we both understood the case was still proceeding unless we reached a settlement. She said she knew that. She said she knew the lawsuit looked bad. She said she knew I hadn't been wrong to ask her to leave. She said her attorney had told her, when the discovery documents came back, that the texts were not helpful to her case, and that he had advised her to consider whether she wanted to continue. She said she was calling because she wanted to know if there was a way through this that didn't end with us hatting each other. I sat with that for a moment. I thought about what I actually wanted, which was a question I had been asking myself since I built the spreadsheet, and which had a more complicated answer than I had initially expected. What I wanted, in the simplest possible form, was for my sister to understand what 4 years had cost me. Not just the money, although the money was real and significant. What I wanted was for her to understand that I had built something, that it had taken years and every spare dollar and many nights and weekends, and that her belief that it was available to her indefinitely without consequence had cost me in ways that went beyond the spreadsheet. I told her what I wanted. I told her I wanted her to understand that the house was not a given, that nothing I had built was a given, that I had built it with my own hands and my own money and my own time, and that handing it to her without structure had been my mistake, but that her failure to honor even the terms she had proposed herself was hers. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I think I just always assumed you were fine, that you could absorb it, that you were the kind of person things don't stick to." That sentence landed somewhere deep. I told her that was exactly the problem, that I was the kind of person things don't stick to until the day they all stick at once. She asked what it would take to make it right. I told her to drop the lawsuit. I told her to move out by the date in the original notice, which she was already past by then, and which we would need to negotiate with Patricia. I told her I was not going to pursue the back rent in court, not because I had given it up, but because it would take years and cost more in legal fees than it would recover, and because I did not want to spend years of my life in litigation with my sister. I told her that the $2,000 she had paid was all I expected to see, and that I was accepting that loss as the cost of a lesson I should have learned earlier. I told her one more thing. I told her that if she wanted a relationship with me going forward, it was going to be a relationship between equals, which meant I was not going to be her safety net, and she was not going to assume she had access to mine. That we could be sisters and be close and show up for each other in the ways that families genuinely do. But that the particular arrangement we had been in, the one where I held and she borrowed, was over. She said okay, quietly without argument. She said she was sorry, not with caveats, not surrounded by explanations, just the two words. I told her I heard her. The lawsuit was withdrawn 11 days later. Renee moved out of 114 Clement Street on a Thursday, which felt fitting, since she had moved in on a Thursday 4 years earlier. I did not help her this time. She hired movers, which was the first time in her adult life that she had hired movers rather than assembled a volunteer crew of people who felt responsible for her logistics. Marcus pointed that out to me afterward, and I told him it was a small thing. He said small things were how you tracked the direction of something larger. I went to the house the afternoon after she left. I walked through it room by room with a notepad. The way I had walked through it the first time I saw it, when it was condemned and full of mold, and the roof had a section that had given up. It was in better shape than that. It was in worse shape than when I had handed her the keys. The bedroom was still midnight harvest. The shelf was still on the kitchen wall, which I would need to address. The garden bed had done exactly what I expected to the drainage, and I would need to bring someone in to regrade that corner of the yard. There were scuffs on the hardwood in the hallway I had refinished myself, the kind that come from years of living, which is to say they were not malicious, just the ordinary cost of time and use. I stood in the kitchen for a while. Then I sat down on the floor, which I had done many times in this kitchen when I was in the middle of renovating it, sitting on the subfloor before there was any floor, eating lunch from a bag, looking at what the room might become. I sat there for about 10 minutes without doing anything. Then I got up, opened the notepad, and started writing the punch list. I listed it 3 weeks later at $1,650 a month, which was market rate for the neighborhood by then. I had 4 applications within 10 days. I selected a retired teacher named Harold who had excellent references and a 12-year rental history with the same prior landlord, who I called and who spoke about Harold for 7 minutes without taking a breath. Harold moved in on the 1st of the following month and paid his first and last month's rent and his security deposit with a personal check that cleared the same day. I framed the deposit check, not because of the amount, but because of what it meant, which was that the property at 114 Clement Street was finally doing what it was built to do. Here is what the last year has looked like. Harold is a model tenant. He calls when something needs attention, and he waits for me to address it, and he thanks me when I do. He leaves the house cleaner than he found it. He renews his lease without drama. He is, in other words, everything a tenant can be, and I did not know how much I had been missing that baseline of mutual respect until I had it. The income from 114 Clement has allowed me to begin preliminary research on a 4th property, a duplex 2 miles away that has been sitting vacant for a year, and that I recognize the way I recognized 114 Clement the first time I drove past it. The bones are there. The potential is there. The work is enormous, and it's mine to do. My sister found an apartment on her own, a 2-bedroom in a neighborhood south of the city, which she pays for on the salary from the event coordination job she has held for 2 years now, and which, to her credit, she has grown into. She has not asked me for money since the call 3 days before the mediation. She has not referenced the property or the lawsuit or the years that preceded it, except once, in a text she sent on my birthday in the spring, which said, "I know I can't make up for what I took from you, I'm trying to be someone who doesn't take. Happy birthday, I love you. I read that text several times. I saved it, not in the litigation folder, in a different one. My mother called me when the news that the lawsuit had been dropped made its way through the family, which in my family takes approximately 48 hours. She said she was relieved. She said she was glad we had worked it out. She did not say that she was proud of me for holding the line, which is the thing I think I wanted her to say, and which I have learned is not something I should expect her to say, because it would require her to acknowledge that there had been a line worth holding, and that would require her to acknowledge what had been happening on the other side of it, which is not a reckoning my mother is built for. I have accepted this. It is not the acceptance of someone who has given up, but of someone who has finally, accurately, assessed what is available and chosen to want what she can actually have. My father called the week after. He called on a Sunday morning, which is when he calls, and he talked about the weather and the Titans' offensive line for a while, and then he got quiet in the way that means something is coming, and he said, I should have said something. Over those years, I knew it wasn't right. I should have said something to Renee. I told him I appreciated that. He said he was sorry he hadn't. I said I understood. We stayed on the phone for another 12 minutes talking about Owen's basketball season, and it was the most comfortable I had felt talking to my father in several years. Owen, for his part, asked me last month whether Aunt Renee was going to be at Christmas. I told him yes, I thought she would be. He said good. He said he liked her, and that he hoped the thing that happened with the house didn't make us stop being a family. I told him no. I told him the thing that happened with the house was what a family looks like when it needs to be honest with itself and doesn't know how, and that honesty, when it finally arrives, is not the end of a family. It is a different beginning. He looked at me with his father's patience and said, That's kind of a lot, Mom. I told him he was right. I said we'd talk about it more when he was older. He went back to his homework, and I went back to my spreadsheet and the fourth property, the duplex 2 miles away with the broken gutters and the good bones and the enormous amount of work ahead of it. The kind of work that takes years and costs more than you plan and turns into something that your father calls real from the highway on the way home. I know what I'm doing. Here is the one thing I want you to take from this, if you take anything. I am not telling this story so you will be angry at my sister. She is not a villain. She is a person who was never asked to understand the bottom of the well because I never showed it to her, and she organized her life accordingly. That is not a justification. It is an explanation. The difference matters. What I am telling you is this. The documentation is not the paperwork. The documentation is the conversation you have out loud, in specific terms, the first time, before anything goes sideways. The lease is not a lack of trust. The lease is the thing that makes trust possible, because it makes the terms visible to both people and removes the assumption that love and generosity are the same thing as an unlimited line of credit. I handed my sister a house and called it love. And it was love, genuinely. But love without structure is not kindness. It is a blank check that someone else gets to fill in, and the amount they write is rarely what you had in mind. Write it down. Sign it. Put a date on it. And then be the steady one, the reliable one, the one who holds things together, but do it with your name on the deed and your terms on the paper and your eyes open to the difference between someone who needs a bridge and someone who has decided you are the bridge. That's the whole story. 4 years, $2,000 received, $85,000 almost lost, 1 lawsuit, and a house that finally earns what it was built to earn. If this hit somewhere close to home tonight, share it with the person who needs to hear it. Subscribe if you want to be here for the next one. And leave me a comment. Have you ever helped someone so long that they started to believe your help was a right? I will read every single one. See you in the next story.